Hey guys, Miss Arden here. This video is just going to be me reading the article that you're going to be using for days 11 through 15. So every question that you're going to answer this week for your AMI activity is going to be based off of this article, okay? And the article is at the end of your packet. It's this one right here, but I've also posted it in a Google Doc on Classroom in case you want to use ReadWrite with it, and to make the text a little bit larger and easier to see. Okay, so if you want to follow along with me, I'm going to read this out loud. This article's title is Caught in the Middle, U.S. Civil War Forced Mexican Americans to Take Sides. It's by History.com and it was adapted by Newsella. In 1861, tens of thousands of Mexican Americans were living in the territories of California, Texas, and New Mexico. Just 20 years earlier, these lands were a part of Mexico. Then, after the Mexican-American War, the United States claimed these territories as its own, like we know the United States likes to do. The American Civil War broke out in 1861. The wounds of the Mexican-American War were still fresh when people living in these formerly Mexican lands found themselves in the middle of the United States' war with itself. At first, Mexican Americans in Texas, commonly known as Tejanos, tried to avoid declaring support for either side. They wanted to stay in the middle, says Sonia Hernandez. She's a professor at Texas A&M University. She teaches history and Latino, Latina, and Mexican American studies. Some Tejanos avoided the conflict, but others chose sides. Some outright avoided joining either side because Tejanos were accused of disloyalty even before the war officially broke out, she writes. By claiming Mexican citizenship, Tejanos could avoid being forced to join the U.S. military. And some were in fact Mexican citizens, Hernandez writes. Still, others, overwhelmed with the growing divide, chose sides. So what this is saying is that if you were a member of the United States, if you were a United States citizen, you could be drafted to the Civil War. So a lot of them would claim to be Mexican or citizens of Mexico in order to not have to fight in the war. Jerry D. Thompson is a history professor at Texas A&M International University. He estimates a few thousand Mexican Americans joined the Confederate troops and more than 10,000 joined the Union Army and militia. Remember, Confederate is the South, Union is the North. Though there were some overlap, most Mexican Americans who joined the Union lived in the U.S. territory of New Mexico or the state of California. Meanwhile, most who joined the Confederacy lived in Texas, one of the states that opted to leave the Union. At least 2,500 Tejanos joined the Confederate Army, the South. Mexico had banned slavery in 1829. This was several years after the country won its independence from Spain. Some Mexican Americans might have joined the Union because they opposed U.S. slavery. There is some evidence that there was a mini underground railroad here in South Texas that was largely fueled by Tejanos, usually poor Tejanos, who would help runaway slaves escape into Mexico, says Thompson. We know there were thousands of runaway slaves to Mexico. At the time, some wealthy Mexican Americans owned slaves, and their income depended on the slave trade. You also had well-to-do individuals like Colonel Santos Benavides here in Laredo, who actually became the highest-ranking Tejano officer in the Confederate Army, says Thompson. There are instances of him acting as a slave catcher where he's actually going into Mexico and retrieving these runaway slaves and returning them to their masters, for which he was compensated or paid back. And I want you guys to remember that Texas's whole fight for independence, one of the main issues why Texas and the Texans living there and Mexico disagreed is because Texans wanted to own slaves, right? Mexico had outlawed that. But prejudice from white soldiers on both sides. Many Mexican-American Civil War soldiers deserted their positions in the military. This is mostly because of the prejudice they experienced from white soldiers on both sides, according to the National Park Service. There was even one Tejano captain, Adrian J. Vidal, who had joined the Confederacy and then deserted to the Union. He then deserted the Union Army too. This time he went to fight against the French colonists in Mexico who supported the Confederacy. There were other reasons Mexican Americans might have wanted to join the Union. In the early 1840s, the white-run Republic of Texas had invaded New Mexico. At the time, New Mexico's lands were still part of Mexico. The invasion was an attempt to seize or take more land. This led to a deep resentment in New Mexico of Texans. Thompson says, The vast majority of Mexican Americans in the New Mexico Territory who entered the war fought for the Union. They fought for the North. They fought against slavery. It had promised a payment of up to $300 for those who became soldiers. In contrast, the Civil War deeply divided the Mexican Americans of Texas, Thompson writes for the Texas State Historical Association. Tejanos who joined the state's Confederate militia, or like Little Army, unit frequently did so out of fear of being sent out of the state and away from their families. Some were able to avoid forced military duty by claiming their residents of Mexico. In Texas, many Tejanos were angry with white Texans for taking away their land. They might have joined the Union as a form of revenge, Hernandez suggests. Others simply wanted to remain in the area, and it was easier if they supported the Union to stay and protect their communities as opposed to being sent to other parts of the South, she writes. Mexican Americans fought both far away and close to home. Mexican Americans who joined the Confederacy, the South, fought as far away as Virginia and Pennsylvania, but Mexican American soldiers in the Union fought closer to home. They helped secure key victories in the Southwest. In 1862, Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Chavez led Union troops in an attack on a Confederate supply train at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. The Union victory helped push the Confederacy out of New Mexico for good. It later earned Glorieta a nickname, the Gettysburg of the West, referring to the famous Civil War battle in Pennsylvania. All right. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Send your teachers an email. Thanks, guys.